California's 400,000 farm workers has dwindled, enough to be statistically insignificant. There's a number of reasons for that, says Democratic political consultant Andrew Acosta.
It's a workforce that's not in one place for very long, and we have national immigration issues that are problematic.
Support from key Democrats, including President Joe Biden, played a role in the decision by Newsom, who's building his national profile, Acosta says. Newsom vetoed a similar bill last year. I'm Lily Jamali for Marketplace.
And there's news just now that despite higher interest rates, U.S. consumer spending rebounded in August, up 0.4%. You're listening to the Marketplace Morning Report from APM, American Public Media.
North Florida TPO, proud sponsor of WJCT's First Coast Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
Wayne Hogan of the Terrell Hogan Law Firm. I'm Wayne Hogan. A company's cell phone policy can protect your employees and your bottom line. Our distracted driving presentation for the workforce can help. Learn more at waynehogan.law.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect with Melissa Ross. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
Opinions expressed on the Friday Media Roundtable are those of our panelists and do not necessarily reflect the views of WJCT News.
Call it a near miss. I'm Melissa Ross, and just ahead this hour on First Coast Connect, our Friday Roundtable takes a look at the impact here and across the state of Tropical Storm Ian. The former hurricane caused widespread damage across much of the Florida Peninsula. In our area, flooding was the worst of it. Give us a call, get on the line now, and let us know how you weathered the storm. We'll also look at the aftermath, the emergency response, and efforts to ramp up Jacksonville's resiliency efforts, too. It's all ahead right after the news.
It's 1 minute after 9 o'clock. This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning. I'm Michelle Corum. Florida's property insurance market was already on shaky footing before Hurricane Ian made landfall. WJCT News' Raymond Troncoso reports state officials have moved to prevent insurers from dropping customers in the storm's aftermath.
Half a dozen Florida insurance carriers became insolvent this year, while others dropped tens of thousands of policies amid severe financial losses, leading to over 1 million customers signing to the state's Citizens Property Insurance. Governor Ron DeSantis says in the aftermath of Ian, most claims will be through national agencies, while the state and Citizens Property Insurance both retain billions of dollars in surplus funds to help people recover from the storm.
And look, at the end of the day, we've had a lot of issues with property insurance, but a lot of that is because of lawsuits and a lot of things that don't focus on the core business. This is the core business of paying these claims, and we understand that time is of the essence.
State officials issued an emergency order Wednesday that will suspend cancellations and non-renewals of policies by property insurers for the next 2 months. The order also bars insurers from canceling or not renewing policies for 90 days after a property is repaired. Raymond Troncoso, WJCT News 89.9.
A Putnam County man and woman became 2 of Northeast Florida's first known Hurricane Ian-related fatalities as they tried to navigate across roads last evening in standing water. A 37-year-old man from San Mateo and 30-year-old woman from Palatka were eastbound on Cracker Swamp Road about 5:30 when the car hydroplaned, according to a report from our partner, News for Jax. No rain now in Jacksonville, just cloudy, 65 degrees. We expect highs today in the low 70s.
A near miss for much of the First Coast, but lots of flooding left behind by Tropical Storm Ian. Good morning. We are live from Studio 5. I'm Melissa Ross, and this is First Coast Connect. Thanks for listening. Just ahead, our Friday Roundtable breaks down the storm's impact here in our corner of the state and across Florida. Let us know how you weathered the storm. Give us a call at 549-2937. Then later in the hour, the new book documenting all of Florida's weird and wonderful regions. That's later. But first this hour, it's Friday, and here to round up all the week's news, we welcome Dan Scanlon of the Florida Times-Union. Hey, Dan.
Good morning.
Good to have you. In studio, Raymond Troncoso of WJCT News.
Glad to be here.
Claire Goforth of the Daily Dot.
Good morning.
Good to have you both in studio, and also joining us on the line, Tim Gibbons, editor of the Jacksonville Business Journal. Hey, Tim.
Good morning.
So good to have you all. 549-2937 to join us. And of course, it was, let's just call it a near miss for much of the First Coast, thankfully. But Tropical Storm Ian did cause major flooding in St. Augustine and elsewhere in our area Thursday. While much of inland Jacksonville and other portions of the listening area escaped with relatively little damage, happy to say. Now, emergency personnel did respond to more than 300 rescue calls over the last couple of days in St. Johns County in particular, as Ian flooded downtown St. Augustine, Summer Haven, Hastings, Flagler Estates, and Matanzas Inlet. Tens of thousands of people in our area lost power, including our own Raymond Troncoso, who is here with us. Trees were downed, but the total rainfall around the city was much less than the 10 to 15 inches forecasters had initially predicted. That's because Ian's track turned east sooner than they had originally forecasted. Ian makes landfall in South Carolina later today. As for us here in North Florida, airport and bus service resumes today in the city. Schools will likely reopen Monday. As we talk about Ian's impact, we want your calls, especially if you are down in St. Johns County. If you had flooding down there, let us know how your neighborhood made it through. Give us a call, 549-2937. Emails to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Tweets to @MelissaInJax. Dan Scanlon, let's start with you. You've been through, I don't even want to guess how many hurricanes. This one could have been a lot worse for our area.
Yes, we were afraid this would be another Irma with some nasty river flooding downtown in San Marco. And I'll tell you, I'm on the road right now doing work for the Times-Union, just checking up. And there are some nasty spots, but right now, San Jose Boulevard has some tree branches down and nothing much else. But get into San Marco and you'll have LaSalle, you'll have some of the streets right against the river are still underwater. Parts of San Marco Boulevard has some very deep puddling. And I also noted that Southampton Road near Channel 4, which flooded entirely around the park down the street, is still flooded, although you can get through if you've got a truck. I wouldn't recommend it. The other thing I'm noticing is the Pottsburg Creek boat ramp on Beach Boulevard, which was completely underwater, including the parking lot yesterday, is back to normal. Every traffic signal seems to be working except for a few on flash. And right now it just looks like a slightly cloudy Friday morning. But again, be careful in those riverfront roads in San Marco. Some are still underwater, including a road right next to River Oaks Park, because the creek that comes off the river is flooding into the dip in the road next to it.
You know, we were speaking on the show yesterday with City Council member Leanna Cumber, also a mayoral candidate who represents San Marco and lives in that neighborhood. Claire Goforth, after Irma and the devastation of Irma 5 years ago, we learned how vulnerable many of our older neighborhoods are. And I guess 5 years on, the question is, how much more work do we need to do to really get serious about resiliency for Jacksonville and the surrounding regions?
That's a question that we're going to be confronting for the next several decades. And these storms are going to increase in intensity and frequency. That's just a fact, and you can disagree as to the cause, but that is the reality. When Irma came through, I remember it very well. I was at Folio Weekly at the time, so covering local issues, and the amount of devastation and flooding that persisted for days after that storm. It's if you haven't seen it with your own eyes, it can be hard to calculate it, but millions of dollars of damages and livelihoods lost, lives lost. And, there are some things that as a city we have to ask ourselves about our priorities. We certainly do want to have public safety and we want to have a nice, downtown and maybe something better than the Landing, as I have deemed the area that was formerly known as the Jacksonville Landing. But we also need to do the things that aren't quite as sexy, as far as dealing with the rerouting water and drainage and building up bulkheads, and also considering, and this is a very hard pill for many people to swallow, not rebuilding after something gets destroyed that's in an area that's going to continually flood.
Yeah, that comes up again and again. Raymond Troncoso, how much longer can Florida keep doing this? I think is the question we all have. Replenishing the sand dunes, rebuilding in areas that are clearly eventually going to lose to the water.
And a lot of that requires, federal aid and assistance from the federal government for a lot of this. So, I guess it depends on when Florida can stop getting those resources in order to rebuild, because there's a lot of interest in coming to Florida, right? And so if people want to be moving here, there's an issue of space. There's an issue of where are those people going to live? And it's very attractive for, I guess, developers as well to try to get that money to rebuild some of these investments. So it's really hard to say if there's ever going to be a time where people are going to, cut their losses on certain areas.
Tim Gibbons, from the business perspective, if you're looking at short term, if you're looking at this quarter or next quarter, you're looking to profit over the next few years and you're not thinking long term, it doesn't make sense to change the incentives for building along the water, whether it's the coast or whether it's inland riverfront property. But sooner or later, the bill does come due.
No, yeah, always does. I mean, there's also the demand problem, though. I mean, we have 800 people a day moving to Florida. There's, depending on the figures, a bunch of them are coming to Jacksonville. And you look at the areas where people want to live, it's along the water. It's the ocean, it's the river, it's these areas where there's great natural beauty, and every couple of years you get flooded. And particularly if you're new to Florida, you're probably not thinking about that. You move in next to the river, you go for a couple of years with no hurricane, you don't think about it being a dangerous place, but it is a place people want to live. So there's a little bit, as the state's population continues to grow, how we as a society direct people away from those areas. We prohibit building in those areas because people are not going to stop doing it on their own.
If you're just tuning in, it's our Friday Roundtable. Let us know how you made it through Ian, especially if you were in a flood-prone area. Give us a call, 549-2937. We're hearing this morning from St. Johns County officials that those who were evacuated in St. Johns have been asked to wait before they can return home today. Officials in St. Johns County say they're assessing the damage and crews are removing debris as quickly as possible. However, they say this process will take some time. Ian dumped more than 8 inches of rain near downtown St. Augustine. It pushed water over the seawall there at the historic bayfront. It closed the Bridge of Lions. Flooding also hit Hastings, Flagler Estates, other low-lying areas. Hundreds of rescues performed by St. John's Fire and Rescue officials. Dan Scanlon, they said it was the worst in their county since Hurricane Matthew in 2016. Yesterday on this program, we got a call from a listener who lived in a mobile trailer park, and she was terrified as she felt the water coming up around her home and realized she couldn't drive out of the property because the roads were flooded. We checked back with her later yesterday. She was rescued. She was gotten out by fire and rescue officials, but there were hundreds such rescues performed in St. John's yesterday.
Well, the undying image I've got is of the fact that the river water came in 4 or 5 blocks deep into the historic St. Augustine area, and that one red and white sailboat that got loose and was pounding itself up against the river wall around the Bridge of Lions, and reporters being ordered out because it was that deep, the water. Again, they say it's worse. That was worse than Irma. The damage is probably worse than Irma, and we thought Irma was the pandemic event of hurricanes for St. Augustine.
In Nassau, officials warned that a 3 to 6 foot storm surge could cause flooding in their county. They urged residents in low-lying areas to evacuate. Parts of Clay County were under an evacuation order. Now let's widen the picture out to the state level. This storm left more than 2.6 million people without power. 2.6 million people. The governor called it a 500-year flood event. Most of Lee and Charlotte counties were off the grid after this storm went through. Claire Goforth, let's talk about this for a few minutes. JEA crews have been working to restore power in our area to thousands of customers. Full disclosure, your husband is a JEA employee. But, when you think about the fact that about 25% of all Florida residents lost power during this storm, that is truly incredible. And just the scope of the damage and the billions in losses that are going to accrue from this storm. It's going to take a while for the state to even assess that, I think.
It certainly will, and I'm sure I'm joined by everybody here in sending our hearts and our all of our prayers to the people of the west coast of Florida, Fort Myers Beach, Sanibel Island, some other areas. I mean, those places, they're looking at an estimated 80% rebuild in some instances. There are communities that are completely off the grid. It's not a matter of restoring power, it's a matter of rebuilding their entire infrastructure to provide electrical services and cell phone services. There are people in our community, there are people around the state who haven't heard from their loved ones, who don't know if their home still stands, who are missing. And, the state of Florida, this is going to cost billions of dollars. This is going to take years to fix. And, we say the governor says it's a once in a 500-year flood. And, that is the old estimation. But in reality, we're going to see more of these. And,
Yeah, more like once every few years.
Once every few years, because didn't we say the same thing a few years ago? It's going to be really expensive, and people keep moving to Florida. And, like the other panelists are saying, where are you going to live? When you move to Florida, you have to be realistic about the fact that river, it's a beautiful view, but it's also very deadly when a storm comes through, as they will.
Yeah. Raymond, I know someone who lost their home during Irma. Their home was completely destroyed. And after the storm passed, they started rebuilding right on the water again. And I said to this person, "Are you sure you want to do this? Maybe move inland a little bit. You're in a really vulnerable spot, and you could get hit again." But they decided they wanted the waterfront property more than worrying about the risk of what could happen if their home should be destroyed again by a storm.
I think it's notable that, especially with the, scientists say the intensity of these storms are going to be increasing, that sometimes even moving inland isn't really super safe. I mean, Orlando's supposed to be a low risk area for hurricanes, and it got hit pretty hard by Ian. And that's something that, we really don't see that often. Irma had missed Orlando, but it still dealt a lot of damage to it just because of the residual flooding from the storm waters around it when it missed it. But Ian going right through it did a lot of damage to Orlando too. It had some pretty crazy flooding out there. So even moving inland in the state really isn't really a solution if these storms continue to get worse and worse in the future.
What about that, Tim Gibbons? Let's talk a little bit about the efforts to shore up Florida's really fragile property insurance market. A new law was passed to that effect. People that follow insurance markets closely think we need to do more.
Yeah, I chuckled a bit when you said efforts to shore it up. The efforts that were taken last session were many people think were not enough. So Fitch's is projecting somewhere between 25 billion and 40 billion in insured losses for this storm, which is a just huge amount of money. As I think in the lead into this show, they talked about the 6 insurers that went insolvent in the past couple months. Citizens Property is up to, I think it's 1.1 million now in terms of policyholders. The insurance situation in Florida is not where it needs to be. Insurers are leaving, insurers are shutting down. And if we get hit even more severely, Citizens is going to have, severe problems. So it's a concern. It's a big concern, and they're is more that has to be done. I think there's a little bit of the state isn't entirely sure what they need to do, what they can do. Politics is a real thing. You have different insurance companies want different solutions, and people honestly just want their roof replaced when it gets blown off. So it's a hard situation.
With that many billions in claims, Tim, and so many people being dropped by their insurers and being pushed into the citizens bucket, the insurer of last resort, how much more strain does that place on citizens, and at what point might that strain become unsustainable? I think is the long term question so many of us have.
That really is. The $2 billion in reinsurance that was put in place last year is expected to help a lot with that. And it's not like anybody knows exactly where the breaking point is for citizens. I want to say that the number doubled in the past 2 years. I might be wrong on that figure, but we have a chart on our website that one of those hockey stick charts that just keeps on going up. And frankly, the breaking point is going to be after a storm that has widespread damage. That there's nothing wrong with citizens having a lot of policyholders. It's when they have a lot of policyholders they have to pay out. So it's going to hit a point where there is a catastrophic event that just wipes out all of that, and then the state steps in. It will be costly.
But Ian isn't that event.
It doesn't appear to be. The general sense seems to be that the state is able to weather things where they stand now. Now, the state has forbidden insurance companies from dropping policyholders for the next 2 months. So I believe it's 2 months after you have repairs done, if you were damaged in the hurricane. So there's not going to be an immediate flood of people going into citizens because of this, but we're keeping an eye on 2-3 months from now. There are some who expect there to be a surge of customers being dropped, insurers going out of business, and just a new, not trying to have a pun, but a new flood of people coming into citizens in a couple months. And at some point, it will be closer to the breaking point.
Raymond.
For all of these insurers, there's basically a kind of a blanket ban on dropping claims or non-renewing contracts that people have with their carriers until November 28th. So that's kind of the grace period where for these next 2 months, you can't be dropping people who have insurance with you, property insurance. And then furthermore, there's a 3-month period after your repairs are actually done to make sure that, everything's on the up and up after the repairs are done for your property. There's a 90-day period in which they can't be dropping customers or non-renewing their contracts if they happen to end around that time.
Mm. And then after that, will we see more of what we've been seeing? Claire, go forth. People getting a notice out of the blue that their insurance company is dropping them for reasons that seem sketchy. Sometimes people are told, well, your roof is 10 years old. That's too old. We can't insure it anymore. We've heard a lot of that lately.
Yeah, I mean, unless the Florida legislature, the government steps in and does something to regulate these insurance companies who are craven in many instances, we are going to continue to see people losing their policies. I know of people in my own life who in recent days, as the storm approached, were frantically checking to make sure that they were still going to be covered and they were going to have coverage through the end of the year. Sometimes storm damage happens days later, and that cutoff can be the difference between being able to rebuild and being, living in a shell of a home. And that does no one any good. We can't have people living in our community without a roof. It's a health hazard. It's a human rights violation in some cases. And it's really distressing where we live in this wonderful state that we live here. Most of us love living here for various reasons. But the focus of our government currently has been on sort of weird identity politics things and culture wars, and not things like the insurance crisis, because it's a game of distraction. But people are having really real issues with property insurance. They're having real issues with the affordability of rent, and housing prices are skyrocketing. And those are things that our representatives are elected to address. And we have some local ones who are looking into that very hard. I know Representative Angie Nixon is one of the ones who is very much on the forefront of these issues. But we need consensus in the state to address what are very serious issues facing our citizens.
If you're just tuning in, it's our Friday Media Roundtable as we discuss Ian and its aftermath. Give us a call, 549-2937. A listener tweets the show, the state should consider banning coastal development and buying out those already in the marshes. It's unsustainable to keep allowing developers to fill in marshland for neighborhoods. Another listener says, please let everyone know the traffic lights still aren't working at JTB and Gate Parkway at the exit to the St. John's Town Center. Leonard sends an email saying there's a website that shows daily rainfall amounts from volunteer observers across the country. There's a big difference across Duval County as you look at the different spots. So that's true. Thanks for sending that because we did see a big difference in how people experienced this storm. 549-2937 on Facebook. Paula says, I was in contact with friends in South and Southwest Florida on social media. After all the anticipation, it wasn't much of a storm when it finally made it to us. Dan Scanlon, a minute ago, Claire mentioned State Representative Angie Nixon. She was part of a contingent going up to volunteer to sandbag a really vulnerable area of the city, homeowners along Ken Knight Drive. They got absolutely sucked with flooding after Hurricane Irma. The city got millions actually from the United Arab Emirates, controversially so, to help repair that neighborhood. Some activists like Hope McMath, who's been a leading activist to help those folks on Ken Knight Drive, have accused the city of not allocating those funds properly, not spending the money properly, not helping enough people. That is worth some follow-up as we try to ascertain exactly where the money went and where things stand in that neighborhood. You and your colleagues at the Times-Union have been following that story as well.
Well, I was amazed. I'm not amazed. Readers were amazed on Tuesday when I reported that every county around us was doing sandbag giveaways, and Duval County's officials said they did not because the sandbags don't work with our Duval County's drainage system. And then I noted that volunteers were doing that for the Ken Knight Drive area. They flood in a bad rainstorm. Water comes up to doors in a thunderstorm. It is an example of a river plain and a creek plain that has changed dramatically over the years, and now with higher average water, they're getting socked. So around Pottsburg Creek, so are those around some of our greenscape sites, McCoy's Creek, etc. It's just the changing nature and global warming out there that's causing this. But if there's money allocated, spend it. I don't know what to do. Maybe you have to build a dam someplace to control the water along Ken Knight Drive.
Yeah. Raymond, this is something that we watched happen so excruciatingly 5 years ago after Irma. That neighborhood, not the only neighborhood to be extremely vulnerable, but one of the most vulnerable. And so 5 years later, to see volunteers going out to try to help the same neighborhood, which still hasn't been sufficiently fortified, is pretty discouraging.
Yeah, I guess it's a matter of priorities. When we're talking about resilience in Jacksonville, it's what do they mean by resilience, and what areas are they trying to shore up when they're pumping money into resilience? It's usually stuff around the beaches. It's going to be stuff downtown. There's some neighborhoods that kind of aren't really the priority for when we're doing this resiliency stuff. And, good on those neighbors for stepping up and trying to help people out and taking real community action to help people. When, this was, as far as I know, Jacksonville hasn't given out sandbags in maybe the last decade. And they talk about this separate municipal sewer system that they have. But, when it's separated like that, there's definitely some that need a lot more upgrades than others. We can put it that way in terms of their drainage systems. And that's seriously something that needs to be addressed. And as far as I know, there is money for that and the capital improvement plan, but it's a matter of actually seeing those dollars going to work and seeing that development happen.
Claire, go forth.
If I recall correctly, Ken Knight Drive, in addition to the UAE money that was very controversial, there was also some federal program that they were beneficiaries of. I reported on this at the time, and there was concern among the residents there that the landlords were just going to take the money and not use it to do what they were supposed to do in terms of fixing the roads there. And, I would walk up and down the street talking to people, and it was days after the hurricane, and they were pointing out, giant piles of debris and and standing water and trash issues and things like that. And they're like, we get politicians coming in here and they make a big show and then they disappear and nothing happens, nothing changes. And it is very discouraging, as you said, to see that. And we need to really ask them where'd that money went. What did they do with that money? I mean, there was they think they had done something like build something riverfront as this riverfront park thing. And people were like, this park is great. Yes, but we need you to fix the flooding issue. You need to fix the drainage. It's lovely to have a swing set, but I'd rather not have my couch floating in my living room.
We would prefer not to have that. 549-2937, JD in Jacksonville. Hi, JD. Good morning. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to bring up the fact that isn't it time the American taxpayer said enough is enough? FEMA's payouts, just in hurricanes alone. Now, Ian could easily become the most expensive hurricane yet, reaching $200 billion in damage. How much of the American taxpayer is going to take of this? For 70 years, the fossil fuel industry has known that these changes, and again, this is just hurricane. This doesn't include fires, disasters like the freeze in Texas, tornadoes, all the other things that FEMA has been paying out. The top 10 hurricanes payout was $425 billion. Okay, we're reaching DOD levels of taxpayer money. Isn't it time Congress held some of the actual causes of this, held their feet to the fire? Because the American taxpayer is going to go broke having to pay for all of these disasters. And like I said, Ian could easily be reaching the top level yet. Hurricane Katrina was a $157 billion hurricane, the most expensive in the history. That don't include all the other ones. But if Ian reaches the $200 billion mark, Congress has to act. The people have to have some relief here because the American taxpayer can't afford DOD charges for disasters that we knew are made and we know where they're coming from. This climate change issue has got to come to a head in Congress, and it's time the American taxpayer had some relief.
Thanks, JD. Tim Gibbons, Jacksonville Business Journal. The recently passed Inflation Reduction Act does have major provisions focused on climate change mitigation efforts, incentives to get us off fossil fuels. There are a lot of moving parts to that act that do try to get at some of these problems. Climate justice, environmental justice, and climate scientists, activists, they all say the measures didn't go far enough. And of course, getting the Inflation Reduction Act passed at all took a Herculean effort in the Congress. And so when we think about the future of where we're going with these increasing costs from bigger and stronger storms, which are fueled by warmer ocean water, water that's warming because of a warming planet, wildfires, as the caller mentioned, droughts, inland flooding, there are going to be so many cascading effects as he correctly pointed out, are getting more and more and more expensive. How do you see the corporate world responding to this? Because it is financially unsustainable. And how can the business community put more pressure on the political leadership to really ramp up the timeline, honestly, for decarbonizing, which is what needs to happen?
That is one of those interesting things as you look at politics that we have a governor who will decry woke capitalism and will talk about the having the state not invest with fund managers who pay attention to things like climate issues. On the other hand, you have industry who is looking and saying it doesn't make financial sense to build something that's going to get washed away. It doesn't make sense to invest in something that's going to catch on fire if there's a wildfire. So there's almost a different motivation. The typical environmental concern of we all want a clean planet is one thing, but at some point you say you want a planet that does not have billions of dollars being spent to deal with the effects of wildfires and stronger hurricanes and rising sea levels. So I think there is a motivation going into the business community that says something like this has to happen. And it does lead to things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as you said, activists say doesn't go far enough, but does go further than I think anybody actually anticipated.
Yeah. 5492937. And as we bring it back down to the local level, let's talk about the fact that the Jacksonville City Council this week approved Mayor Lenny Curry's eighth and final budget, $1.55 billion. It includes a property tax rate cut and nearly $500 million in capital spending for parks, roads, and drainage, downtown, and other infrastructure. Dan Scanlon, Florida Times-Union. Infrastructure improvement, drainage improvements, obviously all very important, much needed. At the same time, this conversation about creating more sustainable neighborhoods for the city. We have a chief resiliency officer now, Ann Colanisi, who's on the job and working on making this a more resilient city. But I think there's a concern that because Ian largely passed us by, that there is less urgency around the idea of creating neighborhoods that are better protected for storms of the future. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm driving on Julington Creek Road right now, and I can remember we had 4 tropical storms hit us over 4 consecutive weeks some years ago, and many of the homes on the creek side were flooded, including one I remember that had a basement built with a pump to keep it dry. At what point do you keep on helping those people who live right on a waterfront? At what point does someone not say, move these houses away, and okay, fine, the folks across the street now get the riverfront or oceanfront view with a road in between, because you can't afford even sinking your concrete poles 30 feet down on some beachfront homes to prevent them from washing away. You can't continue paying for what gets washed away. So the bottom line is I'm looking at docks that are underwater still on some of these side creeks along Julington Creek right now as I'm driving. I know I'm going to get up to a certain boat ramp and it's going to still be underwater. And here's water that actually encroached on a house off a creek I'm driving past, and probably yesterday was across Julington Creek Road. At what point do we continue to have development on these waterfront, creekfront, and riverfront roads? And I'm passing dozens of new homes as I'm driving.
Yeah. It's going gangbusters, Claire. It's no end in sight. And, yesterday we spoke with an expert on insurance reform and insurance markets. And what he said was, it's not just a Florida thing. All up and down the eastern seaboard, you see the same thing.
Oh, I'm sure that you do. And when we talk about insurance, we always think about homeowners and business owners, but we should also think about people who live in apartments. Many people don't have apartment insurance. That is an area that's actually tends to be more affordable. And I mean, you may think that, well, my landlord is going to be responsible for the roof, but you're going to be responsible for your furniture. So, if you live in an apartment, consider getting renter's insurance. And, you're right. And the previous caller is right. Everywhere you go, you're seeing development. What we see is clear lot development, draining the natural wetlands and putting in retention ponds. And the reality is, while it's good that we put in retention ponds, that is not as effective at absorbing storm surge as the natural habitat is. We continue these sprawling developments instead of high density housing. And this is just the result is going to be intense flooding in other areas where the water has been displaced. But I really thought the previous caller who was talking about holding the oil and gas industry, the fossil fuel industry accountable, made a very interesting point. They're making record profits. This is not an industry that is hurting. They are laughing all the way to the bank, and we're paying the price as taxpayers and citizens. We have seen previous cases where very large companies and industries have been held accountable, such as the tobacco industry. There is some precedent for this to actually make those responsible who have also been lying for decades about the impacts of fossil fuels on climate change, which has led to many people disbelieving the facts in front of their faces. But there is some precedent for holding them to account, and maybe it's time to really consider that, or at a minimum, stop subsidizing them.
Yeah, and I think more than any other state, Florida taxpayers have that case to make. Raymond Troncoso.
Yeah, I mean, there was the whole thing with solar power and, the issue of, they wanted to basically make it so that people essentially were penalized if they wanted to move towards more renewable energies for their home. And, that was a big issue. Even Ron DeSantis took a stand against that when that was something that power companies wanted to do, that a lot of them rely on, fossil fuels for their power. In terms of, these new developments that we've been talking about, I was in Fort Myers in June, and the street that, I was staying at, it's all gone now. I literally watched a video from the street that I was staying at of everything that was on that street getting washed away. And while I was there, I toured a new development. It wasn't even complete yet. I was touring a new development that was being built with my mother, and she, texted me an image of it and was like, those houses weren't even built yet, and now they're all gone.
All gone. Unbelievable. Ray emails the show. The governor said at his hurricane press conference that we have $700 million in surplus revenues to overshadow the president's pledged federal assistance. Did the governor say if any of those state surplus funds would be for disaster assistance? We saw Tim Gibbons, the president, and FEMA pledge immediate disaster relief to Florida. So a combination of state and federal funds are being deployed across the state to bring relief to people who have been devastated by this storm.
It is, and like everything else in this world, that there can't not be a political fight taking place where, from sitting here, it looked like the White House stepped up pretty quickly and said that they would be providing federal money. But, there was the entire argument about which officials did the president call and when did he call them. And I'm not sure if any of that really matters to the people who have seen a devastating loss of property or a loss of life. Step back for 1 second. A moment ago, you said something about the Florida's well positioned or should be pushing for companies to take environmental concerns seriously. I do find it interesting that the state has barred its pension fund from considering climate change issues. That's companies that are taking climate change seriously. The state does not want the pension fund considering that when they decide who to invest in. Which actually is kind of the opposite of what one might think a state like Florida, who's dealing with the effects of climate change, should do.
Thanks for pointing that out. 5492937. John on the South Side. Hi, John.
Good morning, Melissa, and thank you for taking my call into your panel this morning. I just really wanted to weigh in locally on the resiliency and specifically to Duval County, and just share with everybody that, any development or anything that has to do with the waterways or has to go through the city council, and the bills, the way they are assigned, goes through the rules chair. So you had Brenda Priestley Jackson, who was the previous rules chair the last 2 terms, and you have a new one now with Michael Boylan. And the thing is, when there is an issue and a constituent has a concern, and they go to their council member and say, hey, how come this isn't before waterways? Well, it's because of the rules chair. So there is this little bit of a ethical breakdown, if you will, in my opinion. And just to give you a heads up, when you talk about downtown, there's a bill for the Armory to amend that agreement, and that's going to be on first reading, as well as other projects where development is overtaking what should be places in place that can absorb water. But the big point really is to dig into it. Last council meeting I went to, Brenda Priestley Jackson is now an alternate, and she emailed or sent a correspondence to Councilmember Freeman, with some concerns on this. So, waterways, people just need to start showing up, even the riverkeeper.
Thanks for that. You're talking about the Jacksonville Waterways Commission, I think, John. Dan Scanlon. Oh, sorry, I had you on hold there. Dan Scanlon.
I'm sorry, I just had a little issue. All I heard was me. What's the question again?
He was talking about the Jacksonville Waterways Commission and how they interact with the Jacksonville City Council, and whether there is enough oversight given to building in places that are going to interact negatively with water?
Well, federal government agencies are recommending you don't do it. Some state agencies are recommending you don't do it. Maybe there needs to be an interagency group that works on these applications and determines floodplain issues and what should and should not be built, if only to save money from having to buy out the property owner after water takes over their property. Speaking of which, the Hood Landing Road boat ramp is fully shut. The Julington Creek has flooded all the way up to around the curve, and yesterday there were police out there because 4x4s were actively playing in the water, which is dangerous and could have resulted in injury or fatality. So right there is development in that area that is probably flooded up against the creek and that maybe should not have been built, but we didn't have Irma's probably at the time to realize it was a not smart idea.
Oh, wow. Thanks for that. Richard on the north side. Go ahead, Richard.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I don't know if it's intentional, but this is probably the most nonpartisan conversation that I've heard about an issue on radio ever. It seems like everybody has put aside party politics, and we're actually talking about the issues. But real quick, I want to mention that you guys, in the story, somewhere earlier, I think, Melissa, you mentioned that the mayor's budget includes a cut of property taxes. And this is the issue that we face when politicians play to the base or they play to those that are lobbying to them, like the oil industry. You end up getting what we just got. We fought hard to get the millage rate increase so that we could get extra money for the school system, only to have the mayor give a tax cut so that the money basically doesn't come from where it was supposed to be as being added. So what's going to happen next year, because prices go up, inflation is going to hit, now we're going to see things need to be cut from the budget, and they're going to be things probably to the most needy and the most vulnerable. If we can now start laying blame on these politicians as much as we've been talking about the corporations, I think the conversation is going to move forward to some real change.
Thanks, Richard. There's that, and not to mention the irony of Jacksonville getting millions in oil money from the United Arab Emirates 5 years ago to help out Ken Knight Drive, a vulnerable neighborhood socked by hurricanes that are fueled in part by the globe's unwillingness to get off fossil fuels. And it was oil money that we used to help Ken Knight Drive. I mean, the irony abounds, folks.
World, and that is largely what they spend a lot of money, the UAE does, on these type of projects around the world, and it's widely known that they do that because they're aware that they benefit so much from the oil industry. But the callers point to the millage rate decrease. I mean, it plays well to the base. It looks really nice on a campaign mailer and in campaign advertisements, and then the next mayor comes in and they have a smaller budget to work with, and that displeases the developers who want their big chunk of the cheese, and that displeases the rest of the city who wants to get drainage fixed and wants to get their roads fixed and sidewalks and all these things. So Jacksonville is a large and growing community, and I know that it is a relief to some people that they are not going to pay as much in property taxes, but then it comes at a cost, and that's just something that we have to be aware of.
And with all of that said, let's round up stories you might have missed from the week. Yes, folks, it's our lightning round. And I'll start. That thunder's a little triggering after all these storms. After bringing a National Hockey League franchise to Las Vegas a few years ago, Bill Foley, the owner of Jacksonville-based Fidelity National Financial, is branching out to elite-level soccer. He says he's reportedly close to buying the Premier League team of AFC Bournemouth of Southern England. He'll be joining Shad Khan in the owner's box. Raymond Troncoso, what's up with you?
So in the aftermath of the storm, something that FEMA and both the governors say is that, they're pretty good on supplies. They have actual supplies. What they need is money and volunteers. So you can go to floridadisasterfund.org if you'd like to give to some people who've been affected by the storm, or you can volunteer to help them out in recovery at volunteerflorida.org.
Thank you for that. Tim Gibbons.
A Spanish surface manufacturer, basically thin countertops, is looking to make its first North American manufacturing site and is looking at Jacksonville and 2 other cities. So trying to figure out what are the chances are that they're actually coming here.
All right. Dan Scanlon.
I'll just hope the Jaguars have another win because, by golly, this is the most exciting start of the season I've seen in decades.
You know, he's right. How about that? Some good news, at least when it comes to this football team. For a change, Claire.
What a difference a coach makes. My lightning round, since everyone else stole mine, thieves. I'm going to go with the gas tax holiday kicks in this weekend, so we will get a little bit much needed relief at the pump.
Yeah, they're going to start that temporarily. The state's 25 cents a gallon tax waived during October. October only. Critics call it an election year stunt, of course, but you will see a break at the gas pump. Prices already going down, which is good too. And I want to thank all four of you so much for coming in after the storm to join us. Dan Scanlon, Raymond Troncoso, Claire Goforth, Tim Gibbons. Guys, always so good to hear your voices and see you here in the studio. Thank goodness we made it through all right, and have a nice weekend, everybody.
Thanks, Melissa.
Stay safe.
Happy
fall, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye.
That's right. When we come back, the new and hyper-local guide to all 7 of Florida's wacky, wonderful regions. A look inside the new book, Florida. After this, we'll be right back.
On the next Fresh Air, historian Jeff Schessel recalls the early days of the U.S. space program, when American rockets blew up in test flights while Soviet satellites and cosmonauts soared through the heavens. He also details conflicts among America's first astronauts, in part over their personal conduct. His book, Mercury Rising, is out in paperback. Join us.
Today at 1 on WJCT News 89.9.
The cleanup begins as the president declares a major disaster for the state of Florida. Meta takes down a Chinese-based network spreading lies and disinformation ahead of the midterms. NASA hits its target 7 million miles away, and the FDA announces a new definition of what can be called healthy. More on the Friday News Roundup next time on 1A.
Today starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, it is the new and hyper-local guide to all 7 of Florida's wacky, wonderful regions. For more about the new book, Florida, I spoke with editor Gabrielle Calise.
So this new book, Florida with an exclamation point, is really fantastic, and it's broken down by region. First, let me ask you, how did this whole project come about?
That is a good question. I am a reporter who's based in Tampa Bay. I work at the Tampa Bay Times, where I'm a culture and nostalgia reporter. And I had just finished working on a guidebook to the Gulf Coast for Wild Salmon Field Guides when A24 reached out to me just to kind of find someone who would help navigate Florida. They've done a lot of work in Florida, documenting all these great stories around the state. And since they're getting into publishing books more, they wanted to just dive into a place. You know, one big book that would kind of cover a lot of different regions around the state that they just are so fascinated with. And because I have done so much work writing about culture, they said, can you take us along for the ride?
What a ride it is. By the way, this is 547 pages, but it's really hyper-local. Each region gives you tips on interesting attractions and foods, and a lot of it is stuff people who even have lived here for a long time might not know about. When I looked through the North Florida section, for example, a lot of the things on your list I hadn't heard of, and I've lived in this area a while. Tell me about some of the more interesting things that you document in the book.
There are so many fun traditions that you will only find in Florida, and I think those were some of my favorite things to sort of touch on. For example, the daddle pepper tradition in North Florida I thought was really fun, just the way that There's a whole festival dedicated to this very hot, very special pepper, and we have tips on how to grow them as well. We have traditions like making honey drippers to stay cool during those hot summer months. We have some really funky landmarks like the signs for Cafe Risque that dot the interstate as you're driving north through the state. I was a student at UF, and so for 4 years, my parents, every time they would drive up to come visit me, they'd give me a call and say, "We see the signs for the Cafe Risque strip club. We know that we're getting close to you." And it turns out that there's actually some funny history behind it. We have, of course, some really fun film history. So we told the story of Norman Studios, which was this fantastic film studio for Black actors in the early 1900s. And we just kind of wanted to have a little bit of something for everyone, touch on some classics while also bringing some surprises too.
Yeah, I mean, there's even a map for North Florida, and I'm looking at it. You've got Rex, the Beach Boulevard dinosaur, included in your list. Pete's Bar, the Bridge of Lions, Crane Ramen in 5 Points, a lot of other interesting places and attractions on the list. How did you compile the list?
So it was a great collaboration between myself and our North Florida writer. So the way that I wanted to do this was I wanted to bring in as many different Florida voices as we could. So as you mentioned, the book is divided by region. So we have 7 different chapters for the 7 different regions that we kind of carved out. And I had written the first region of my home sort of area, which is the Gulf Coast. And while doing that, I kind of came up with a list of other parts of the state that I wanted to explore. And then when we hired our North Florida writer and the other writers around the state, I sent them a survey, and it had a bunch of different questions just to kind of get those juices flowing. Like, if you're going to meet someone, where would you take them if they're visiting you for your perfect day in North Florida, for example? Or who is the unofficial mayor of North Florida? This was kind of a trick that I took from working on the Wild Sam travel guide when I was a contributor for them. They had me fill out a survey, and it really kind of, got those ideas just running through my brain.
Well,
So
who did they say was the unofficial mayor of North Florida?
I think the best unofficial mayor, I mean, there are several folks in here that we have, but I have to give a special shout out to Tim Gilmore. He is a writer and an English professor, and he just knows everything.
He does. And he's such a great writer.
Blog.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I love that he got picked. Now, the other thing about this book is that it really, it captures a lot of the weird stuff in Florida, some of the offbeat, strange things that make this state famous or infamous. How big a focus was that for you?
Well, we wanted to have fun with it. There's something about Florida that is so special, and every place, people will have something special about their hometown or their home state. But there are so many traditions and places and people that you would just only find in Florida. Nowhere else do we have state employees who are working as mermaid performers, at a state park. I just can't think of places where you will open the toilet and maybe see an iguana pop out, but also that state's agriculture board is publishing recipes on how to cook iguanas. Like, there's so much weird stuff that you're only going to find here, but we wanted to do it in a way that honored the love that we have for the state as well. It's not just something where we want to punch down on Florida and make it the butt of a joke. We wanted to celebrate all the things that make it so weird and special to us.
Pick it up now, folks. It's a great gift for the Florida lover in your life. It's Florida, your new guide, your new hyper-local guide to the most far-out state in America. Editor Gabrielle Calisi, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, and I hope you enjoy the ride.
And thanks to our fabulous team here, David Luckin, Heather Schatz, Isabella De Silva, with technical help from Morning Edition host Michelle Coram. And I'm Melissa Ross. Be sure to join me again today at noon for the Florida Roundup. It's our live statewide call-in show, heard every Friday at noon across Florida, from the peninsula to the Panhandle. This Friday, of course, we'll be hearing from every corner of the state about the devastating impact of Hurricane Ian and the cleanup that is now underway. A word of thanks that we made it through all right up here in our corner of Florida. Could have been a lot worse, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
North Florida TPO, proud